Anyway, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the greatest battle in motorsport history. The story begins in the 1960s when Ford realised that they could sell a lot more cars if they were a lot more successful on the racetrack. So they formulated a brilliant plan, but unfortunately it went disastrously wrong, didn't it, Bob? Ford knew that if you wanted to rule in motorsport, there was only one race that mattered. The toughest and most dangerous of them all. The 24 hours of Le Mans.
Levy's Mercedes collides and blows up.
The problem was, for all its might, Ford didn't have a clue how to win at Le Mans. However, over in Italy, someone did. In the early 1960s, Enzo Ferrari's cars ruled sports car racing, Le Mans especially. At the start of the decade, he had won the famous and grueling 24-hour race 3 times on the trot. However, the company was in deep financial difficulty. So when Ford offered to buy the entire business, Enzo agreed. At first, all went well. Enzo Ferrari and the head of Ford, Henry Ford II, quickly settled on a price of $16 million. And on May the 21st, 1963, Ford executives arrived in Maranello to sign the deal. Ford turned up with an army of suits. Enzo Ferrari sat opposite them with just the local town lawyer. Now, they read through the contract and it all seemed well, but then suddenly Ferrari stopped and he took out his famous fountain pen full of purple ink, and as you can see from this accurate copy I have here, he drew a big exclamation mark and he wrote, "No, that's no good." Now, what had angered him? Well, it was this clause here. You see, Enzo Ferrari wanted to retain control of the motorsport side of his business, but this bit effectively handed control to Ford. There followed a tirade of abuse in Italian, after which Enzo said to his lawyer, "Let's go and eat." And they got up and they simply walked out on the stunned Ford executives. That was that. All of this for nothing. Back in Detroit, Henry Ford II, apoplectic with rage, gathered his lieutenants and issued the order: build me a car that will crush Ferrari at Le Mans. To beat Ferrari on European soil, Ford needed European expertise. So he hired a small British motorsport company that set up shop here in this very building on an industrial estate in Slough, just outside London. And the challenges they faced were enormous. They had to build a car that would race at over 200 miles an hour, which was something that had never been done before, and it had to be reliable for the 24 hours of the Le Mans race, a race in which you changed gear 9,000 times and drove flat out for 3,000 miles. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they only had 10 months to do it. Out of that insane timetable emerged this. The Ford GT. Thanks to its sleek shape and a body that stood just 40 inches tall, it promised to cut through the air like a missile. Add a 4.2-litre V8 and the magic target of 200 miles an hour seemed in the bag. The trouble is, a racing car is just a collection of hopes and dreams until it gets on the track.
And that's something that Ford learned in a very brutal way when they took the GT40 to test at Le Mans for the first time.
And so to the first Le Mans practice session.
On its first outing, the renamed GT40 was fast, but it was also terrifyingly unstable, spinning its wheels on the straights.
Now, I'm not talking about when you set off. I mean, it was happening at 170 miles an hour. Now, the problem was either aerodynamics or suspension, but they never got a chance to find out because later that day, the car crashed at 160 miles an hour. Well, that was okay. They had a spare one, of course. The next day, that crashed as well. Le Mans was just 2 months away.
Against all odds, Ford got their act together in time for the 1964 race.
The Le Mans 24-hour race at last, and 3 gleaming Ford GTs are present.
But during the race itself, all the cars broke down or caught fire, leaving bitter rivals Ferrari to take another 1-2-3 victory. In Detroit, Henry Ford decreed that they would be back next year to take on Ferrari again. And to head up the campaign, he turned to an American motorsport hero.
My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business.
Shelby was a former chicken farmer from Texas who took nitroglycerin pills to keep his heart going. But he'd also racked up countless victories as a driver and team owner. Given the task of turning the GT40 into a winner, he put his top man on the job.
Coming up is Ken Miles, one of the best sport car drivers in America.
Miles was a former Second World War tank commander from Birmingham, the one in England, not Alabama. He was renowned for speaking his mind and developing racing cars. Miles took the car for a shakedown, and he got out and he told Shelby and the Ford executives, "It's bloody awful." Then he got to work, improving the brakes, the engine, the aerodynamics, the handling, and taming the car's terrifying high-speed instability. However, and even though he and his team took amphetamines so that they could stay awake all night, there simply wasn't time to develop the car properly for Le Mans. The GT40 may have been faster, but it was still fragile. At the 1965 race, 6 cars started, none finished, and the Italians humiliated Ford once again. So, untold millions of dollars had been spent since the first GT40 emerged from this building here, and yet not one car had even finished the race. So Ford now faced a difficult choice. He could throw in the towel against Ferrari, or he could fight on. What he actually did was he had some business cards printed, and he distributed them to his Le Mans team. And on the cards it said, "You'd better win." And so, a year later, the American giant returned to Le Mans with its hopes resting on this.
Okay, viewers, this is historic race car bucket list moment number 2, because this is an actual GT40 that competed at Le Mans in 1966. Oh, don't go mad, mate. It's worth 15 million quid. Sod it, let's make some noise. Oh, yes.
In this new GT40, Ken Miles had racked up thousands of test hours. Now the car was no longer horribly unstable, but would sit rock steady at 210 miles per hour. And the Brummie tank commander had the backing of Ford's huge R&D department, who tackled the car's appalling reliability.
The brakes no longer went into thermal shock at the end of the long straight. The engine and transmission were run on a computerized test rig that simulated the whole of the 24-hour Le Mans race. Now that's standard practice in Formula One today, but in 1966, that was witchcraft. They weren't mucking about, these blokes.
But neither were the opposition. Over in Italy, in response to the new threat, Ferrari produced this. Called the P3, it looked as sleek as a GT40. And at just 37.4 inches tall, it was even lower.
Holy mother! Let's be a little bit careful on this narrow road. It's worth £20 million.
Where the GT40 boasted a top speed of over 210 miles an hour, The P3 maxed out at just 190, but Enzo Ferrari was willing to trade outright speed for gains elsewhere.
The Ferrari was lighter, it was more agile. Ferrari reckoned he could make up the difference in the bends, and he wouldn't have to stop so often for fuel.
A David and Goliath battle was looming. At the 1966 Le Mans race, Ford arrived with an armada. 8 cars, 20 tons of spares, and a squad of world-class drivers, including Ken Miles himself. In comparison, Ferrari turned up with just a trio of P3s, but Enzo had an ace up his sleeve. The undisputed fastest driver on the planet, Formula One world champion John Surtees.
He had come to me and said, "John, we've got to beat the Fords. Go out and do it." I thought there was only one tactic, to have at least one car be the hare. I said, "Look, I don't mind being the hare. The moment that flag goes down, we need to be bang off, tempting the Ford drivers to perhaps overdrive a little bit. If one could push them hard enough for long enough, then there is more likelihood, obviously, of being able to break them."
The plan was set, but as 0 hour approached, everything unravelled.
Shortly before the start of the race, we learned that he wasn't going to drive, and we asked him about it.
Yes, unfortunately, you've heard correct. I won't be driving.
What is the reason?
Well, I suppose it is best summed up at this stage by saying political reasons.
The problem was that the Ferrari team manager was playing his own political game. He had no particular liking for Surtees, and he nominated another driver to go out and start the race, to be the hare, even though Surtees was clearly the fastest man available.
And I just stormed away, drove back, and had it out with the old man. As the Italian papers put it, they showed a picture of me walking out the gates and saying, "The divorce of John Surtees and Enzo."
With Surtees out of the way, the Fords took the top 4 slots in qualifying. And as the clock ticked down, Henry Ford II prepared to drop the flag, praying that this time he would get his revenge.
Live from Le Mans, France, it's the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
At first, the Fords stormed into the lead, but a few hours in, it was beginning to look like a depressing repeat of 64 and 65. As night fell, the Ferraris, using their greater agility and their greater fuel efficiency, were leading the race 1-2. 4 of the 8 GT40s were out of the race altogether. Worse still, the Ford drivers had strict orders not to go balls out, for fear of breaking the cars. But one man wasn't listening to those orders. Ken Miles put the hammer down, set blistering lap times, and retook the lead for Ford. The Ferraris had no response to this crushing pace, and by morning they had either broken down or crashed. That afternoon, Henry Ford watched his cars cruise home to a spectacular 1-2-3 finish.
First place for the Ford GT Mark II, and a first-time win for America at Le Mans.
Ford would go on to win the next 4 Le Mans races. But the man who had contributed so much to the team didn't get to see these triumphs. Ken Miles was killed 2 months after their first win, testing the latest GT40. It's impossible to calculate how much Henry Ford spent on his 3-year campaign to break Ferrari, but experts reckon that at the very least, in today's money, it was £360 million. Now that's a big bill for settling a spat with an angry Italian. But look what we got out of it. One of the world's greatest cars.
Very good.
hate you.
I know.
No, but I really hate you now because you've driven the Ford GT40 and I never have. I mean, what is it next week? You're going to lick Helena Christensen?
Look, I'm sure you could drive a GT40 if you really wanted to.
I can't. I'm too tall.
Yeah, you mean fat.
Tall.
Horizontally tall.
Well, listen, whatever dimension is the problem, I can't drive one. And on that terrible disappointment, it is time to end. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.